Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Well, hi everybody, I'm Jason Mefford, and today I'm talking to my friend Dan Clayton. And Dan and I met actually when we were working on this little book, the Sawyer's Guide to Internal, or it's not called Sawyer's Guide anymore, it's called Sawyers Internal Auditing.
Right.
And has been added, Enhancing and Protecting Organizational Value. So Dan, thanks for talking to me, because and maybe just give a little background on yourself. You were kind of the project lead on this endeavor that we both worked on. Because we both had blood, sweat, and tears into this book.
Yes, many hours.
Many hours. I mean, I think you spent probably a year and a half of your life.
Pretty much. About 600 hours, so a lot of time.
600 hours. Wow.
Yes.
Okay. Because, it was, in Sawyers, it was really bringing together a bunch of, I think there were 10 or 15 of us that kind of contributed information into the book. And so each of us kind of have our pieces and parts in different places along with comments and stuff. But maybe just to kind of explain too, because Sawyers has been around for a long time, and I remember the one that I had sitting on my desk was, I don't know how they printed that thing. It was like 6 or 8 inches thick in one book.
The 4th edition or the 5th edition.
I think, it was 4th or 5th edition. And huge book, but it's been so valuable for internal auditing. So maybe explain a little bit about, why the IAEA needed to update, why they thought this 7th edition, was important to kind of make some changes. What's going on?
You bet. So, hopefully every industry or every professional is always thinking about how they can do something a little bit better. And so we're no different, as we think about where internal audit has been and where they really want to go as a profession, where we really want to go as a profession. We took a look at the content. So part of my role at the committee that I'm on for the IAEA is looking specifically at content. And they said, all right, of all the content that the IAEA produces, what do we consider like nearly standard-based content? So what's the most important content that's out there? And we started talking about the textbook. We talked about the CIA exam prep materials. And then that really led to a discussion of Sawyers. And Sawyers is a large historical book. And as we started looking at it, there were a variety of questions that really centered around, is this redundant to some of the textbook? Is it redundant to the CIA exam? How do we think about this content that the IAEA is placing out there more in context of where we want to go than really where we've been? Mm-hmm. We had a lot of good discussions about that. Even got an Excel spreadsheet out and did some outline comparisons of where Sawyers was, 6th edition, where the coming CIA exam was, where the textbook was. We looked at Vision University agenda, QIAL agenda, and really just said, hey, these are all really important things. Are they covering everything that we want to cover? And we had to first define that, what should be covered. Mm-hmm. And so in simple terms said, well, really, how do you set up an audit function? How do you deliver audit services? And when we did that, we found some holes and we found a lot of overlap in those resources. And so then the question became, well, can Sawyers transform into something that covers these gaps? And most of the gaps were really the high-level questions. How do you set up this function to be effective? And so it's kind of exciting that the result of that conversation and the result of a committee discussion really was, hey, let's make it the tool that's really focused on the future and how we get closer and closer to the mission of internal auditing. which is to enhance the value of the organization and to play a role in that.
Well, and I think that's maybe a good way to really kind of think about it, because there are these different resources, right? I mean, the textbook's been around, I want to say it's somewhere between 10 and 15 years. I can't remember when that actually came out, but a textbook to really kind of teach people in college how to do internal audit, or if you're new to an internal audit role and you haven't gone through one of those classes in college, it gives you some of the rudimentary things, right?
For sure.
And then we've got the CIA exam, and I think a lot of times people don't realize the information that's there, right? Because as I teach CIA review courses to people, there's a whole bunch of information in there, but unless you're going through the certification, you probably don't think of that as a resource, right? Where it gets into more about the standards and some of the technical things, of how to do stuff that maybe the textbook doesn't. But I think, like you said, for the future of where we're going, or some of the more theory things, that's kind of where Sawyers kind of fits in here, because again, I work a lot with chief audit executives, and so they might go back and glance at the textbook, right? And they probably have their CIA, but it's like, but that doesn't really fit, where they're at. There was kind of that gap of
right.
Where do we want to go to, and that almost kind of brings up the other point of there's a difference between the aspiration level of where internal audit is headed or where we would like it to go versus the day-to-day practice as well.
And that should be true with every strategic plan, right? Mm-hmm. It should always have a gap between your aspirations and where you are today. And what should drive you is the interest in adding more and more value.
Yep.
So that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes we look at that maybe as a bad thing, but it's not. That's really, our profession has to evolve for a variety of reasons.
Well, it has to evolve, and I think, like you said, it's good to have kind of those stretch things, for us to aspire to. The only downside that I see with some of the aspiration is sometimes people look at it and go, "Oh my gosh, I'm not living up to the I'm not living up to the standards, right?"
Yeah.
And if you feel bad about yourself in that way, then I can see where the aspiration can be bad. But if you're just trying to use it as a way to get better, and realize that, hey, where you're at is okay, right? You may not have the picture perfect internal audit activity in your company. That's okay. You can still add value if you're not best in class, right?
Yeah, for sure. And just a quick sidebar. I think, I just attended the GAM conference for the IAEA in Dallas, and, pulled a couple things away from that. And I think something that's particularly important is that as we go through change, and as we, it's not just the CIA exam, which was recently updated, that will have to change. We're changing the basic certification, and we're doing that by acknowledging some of the things that we want to become. So we even moved the bottom bar, in terms of what certification is. We said, hey, it has to be here now. And that's going to continue, and that's going to change. And so now I know there's a couple folks that are looking at the external quality review. So how has an external quality review looked at internal audit in the past? Well, we've looked at it as, do you conform or not? Are you conforming with these standards or not? But had an interesting conversation with one of the leaders involved in it, where, hey, the conversation now in those circles is, maybe it should be forming, conforming, performing.
Yeah.
So how do you elevate the function over time to something a little better? So we, interestingly, as much as we like to say we're independent and objective, not protect the value that we deliver by saying that. We have to actually think about ourselves in a lot of ways, just like any other function. In terms of the value that we're delivering, where's it at today? Where does it really need to be tomorrow to do something better? And so that's really, I think, a lot of the standards, the update of the CIA exam, the look at, the external quality review, Sawyers, all of that's kind of pointing that future of saying, how do we really just set ourselves up to manage an ongoing need to change?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's a good point, because it's, I like that forming, and how'd you say it was forming?
I think it was forming,
conforming,
which would be the standards. You're conforming with the standards, and performing. The idea being you're forming, but you're not there yet, and that's okay.
Yep.
You're just starting, and then you're conforming. You can call yourself a professional internal audit function, and performing is more. That's closer to the mission of internal audit.
Well, and I think that's a better way to think about it, because, couple things that I've seen over the years, right? Because I was a chief audit executive at a couple of places. And I remember, especially at the last place where I was, I went in, and I've been doing this for a long time. I knew kind of what I was supposed to be doing, and started asking some questions, even some basic questions about mission, vision, values of the organization, key objectives, some of the stuff like that. And I started getting these deer in the headlight looks from the executives, and it's like, oh crap, right? Okay, do we have policies? Well, we've got a binder over here, and it's like, okay, time out, right? Before I can get to that conforming or performing stage, if that's what we're going to call it in the future, I've got to form it first. And so I've got to come in, I've got to help actually set up some of these things. And so I probably spent the first at least 2 to 3 years that I was there just helping to get everything in place. So then there was actually something to audit, right? So was I adding value? Yes. Could I have passed a conforming QAR? Nope, probably not at that point, but that's okay, because everybody's on kind of this journey. And I think for people to understand it is a journey is important, because the flip side that I've seen a lot of times is sometimes auditors, and this will end up, as you get up in the audit department, because I've seen this with certain chief audit executives, and they just kind of pound their fist, right? And they're like, damn it, you've got to make me independent. I've got to report to the CEO. I have to do this audit. And they become a pain in the butt to everybody in the organization, right? Which again, that doesn't add value. Or then they almost feel like self-righteous is a harsh word, but almost like, if I can't do it the way I want to do it, then screw you, I'm gone. And a lot of times they end up leaving, and then have a hard time finding another job, or they get fired because they're difficult to work with. And that's not the intention. And so I like that idea of more of like a forming, conforming, performing kind of a thing, because internal audit it's done different ways around the world. And so we have to be real about that.
Yep.
But if you're doing stuff that's helping to add value over time for the organization, that's really the goal.
And it's interesting. So I'm a collector, and I guess I've had the luxury of being a collector of ideas and models over my career by working for 2 relatively large internal audit functions, and so they can afford some overhead to look around the corner. And I've been lucky enough to get those roles where that's been my job for probably 16 of the 21 years I've been out there. And I don't know if that'll be my future. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. But in doing that, it also gives me some insight into conversations. As I sat down at GAM and went through some conversations with different folks, I can kind of see the collateral, positive and negative, of folks that are thinking about what they need to do in terms of value, and those that are not. And so I kind of like the idea of the journey comment, because our industry is headed somewhere. Think about the industry that you're in is headed somewhere. The organization is headed somewhere within that. And so everybody is moving. And so there's no standing still. And so as all of these streams of objectives and goals are moving, if we're standing still, and we're considering our standards as cement in that environment, then we simply are starting to shrink our capacity to add value. We can't add as much value anymore. We are defining tomorrow by yesterday, and we can't really do that anymore. Interestingly, the whole last day of GAM was dedicated to a couple general sessions, where they bring in people that are really going to pump you up, and both of them were about change. How do you anticipate change? How do you manage change? The second one was kind of interesting. And a relatively young guy got up there, and he just pasted a sort of a watermark image of an org chart, and then he pasted a watermark image of a network, and an IT network, and talked about how today more and more folks are thinking of the network. They're wanting freedom and they're wanting safety. The org chart of yesterday is kind of safety. You have somebody that is responsible for you. The org chart of the future is freedom. So how does an organization today, or how does a profession like internal audit help, make sure that we've got standards, so there is structure and safety, but that we're also open to the freedom necessary to continue to build and evolve and add more value.
Well, and I think that's important because, like you said, we can't be stuck in this concrete, like you said, right? And the hard part is a lot of people that are in internal audit, they're the analytical, they're the rule keepers, right? They follow the rules, they expect everybody else to, and it's easy to get stuck into that historical thing, right?
For sure.
Yeah, and we really do have to start thinking about how it's changing, because that's one of the reasons why you kind of pulled me in on Sawyers is, I've done a lot of work with trying to integrate some of these functions within organizations, because organizations are changing. Like you said, right? Everybody's moving, but if internal audit continues to do what it's been doing and not keeping up with those changes, they're going to effectively put themselves out of a job, right? Which is
let me add a tangible example to that.
Yeah.
I was sitting at a table last week, around the table, and you've got one person who, I'm not going to name any names or organizations, but one person who has what I would call an assurance map. Mm-hmm. And essentially, he views his role as being above these growing second line of defense functions. Mm-hmm. Not that he directs them or anything, but as they get stronger and stronger, meaning compliance, information security, quality, safety, as they get stronger and stronger at their particular role and objective of managing that type of risk for the organization, then he backs off. And that means to him, he actually does less of that detailed risk evaluation in those areas, but he does more of looking at that function and making sure that it's preparing for its next step in strength and maturity. Yep. So he's defined his role within these growing, this world of growing regulatory pressure, evolving risk management and evolving functions that all have stronger and stronger professional associations and models directing them as well, particularly information security. So now contrast that with another person at that same table who she was complaining because she recently got operational audit taken away from her. First of all, I don't know how I would have ever let that happen.
But regardless, right?
That was her exact comment. I don't do operational audit anymore. It was taken away from me by the COO and given to safety. So in other words, I'm not responding to a changing environment. The value from internal audit is shrinking, and the trust that the leadership has in internal audit is evaporating. So they're providing another function of the organization with something that really should be an internal audit, at least at a monitoring level. So, that's the world we live in as internal auditors. We can't stand still. We have to get closer to that assurance of assurance functions on the second line of defense, and less in their business of detailed risk, and more in the business of governance and risk management practices within the organization.
Well, and I think that's exactly where it's going to go. I mean, kind of the assurance function on assurance functions. And this is where, again, because I'll share an example of a discussion I had yesterday with somebody about this. But I think that's the mindset. And we can't, it's like a feeling of lack versus a feeling of abundance kind of a thing almost,
Or scarcity, right?
Scarcity, like this lady is saying, oh, you're taking away. It's like, well, you know what? Most of the operational auditing should probably be done by other groups, right? So that it can free up internal audit to move up higher in the organization. So that's where I kind of see the future is, a lot of the checkbox things that are done, they could probably be done by someone else in the organization. And if they do, then it frees up internal audit to tackle more of those politically sensitive issues, the real higher risk things in the organization that often are difficult discussions to have. So I see it as different, where to her, I would say, well, it's good that got taken away. Now it's going to let you level up what you're actually doing and get to that point of being more like the assurance of assurance functions.
Sure.
Because that's really, and a lot of people kind of go back and forth on the 3 lines of defense. Some love it, some hate it. But to me, effectively, the idea is, like you're saying, it's assurance of assurance functions. It's working with those other groups and then just trying to fill the gaps.
I probably would have had, I think for me, I would have had a conversation with her about what she meant by operational auditing first. Because I think
I think
I agree with you, if the kind of operational audit she was referring to is really a transactional review or a review of, low-level processes for efficiency and effectiveness, then I totally agree. If the safety department at least can, her being in a particular industry where that's really important, if they can cover a majority of the operations at that level, great. That means you can take operational auditing to another level.
Yep.
But it also means you have to advocate that level to your leadership so that they understand that that's what you're attempting to do. That you're not taking operational audit from me, but you're allowing me to get higher in the operations in terms of my assessment of what's going on.
Well, and that's a good point, because I think what it does, and this kind of goes back to the discussion I had yesterday, is, unfortunately, much of the time, internal audit, we get way down in the weeds, right?
Sure.
Because by the time you scope a project and then you look at the risk and the controls around that particular area, we're often looking at very low level controls. Okay, that's where the rubber hits the road most of the time from a testing perspective.
Yep.
And that's the history. That's what we've been used to. That's what we know. And so I was talking with the chief audit executive yesterday, and his organization is bringing in ERM. And so he says, I'm having a hard time. I'm on like the working group with these other functions that we're all trying to do an enterprise risk management assessment, but I don't know that it works for my purposes. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Right? He's like, well, because we're so far down here and they're so far up here, right? That it doesn't seem like it works. And I'm like, dude, you should be more up here, right? Instead of necessarily getting down. And so when we started talking about it, it's like that idea of the assurance of assurance functions.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, I mean, that what you do is if you start at the top and you do objective-based risk assessment, you're looking at the objectives of the organization, the strategies that you put in place. Now, are those strategies effective to help us get there? And if they're not, then we've got to have a different strategic discussion. But if they are, what has to work for that strategy to work? And then let's figure out that's where we should test. That's where your risks are. If this doesn't happen, holy crap, it might not work, right?
Yep.
And so you come up with your list of, we'll just say 10 items, okay? And then that next thing for that working group is to say, okay, we've got these 10 things. Who's doing what? Right? And everybody starts raising their hand. Like, I'm working on this one already. I'm working on that one. Oh, we've got some duplication there. Why don't you guys work on that together? And then you start seeing what's left. And it's like, hey, there's 3 of these where we have a gap. Who's the best person to take it? And maybe it's internal audit raising their hand. right? And it'll be a different discussion for everybody in the organization. But once you identify that, then you can start going down to the next level of trying to scope, okay, so of this thing that has to go right, what's the most important thing that has to go right within that process, or else it all falls apart. That goes back to kind of those key controls or key whatever you want to call them. And then we can design a project or an engagement around
So now we're getting into what I consider kind of the most exciting part of the Sawyers book.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about what has to change within an organization or within the internal audit function to get to the level that you just described. So, you've got a staff, that staff historically is really comfortable with validation testing. Give me a standard and I'll test against it, whether it's financial, compliance, regulatory, or policy. I can test against anything. Well, that's the easiest kind of auditing that's out there, and you're validating something. You almost don't need a risk understanding to do that. But as you get into the risk world and you are more focused on the organization, what the organization or what that process or program or operation is trying to accomplish, you do get into the risk world. And so now you need to understand, why are things being done and how are they being done? And so the cool part of Sawyers is we were thinking about, well, how do we set up a book that can help us progress towards executing something that is closer and closer to enhancing and protecting organizational value. So we know we're pretty good at protecting organizational value.
Yep.
That's the regulatory skill set. That's the validation type auditing. How do we enhance organizational value? How do we make sure that things are going as well as they should? And so as we early on, the first chapter is about strategy. It talks about 41 different areas of adding value. The second chapter, we get into the conversation of, hey, what has happened in the past, but then also what are the aspirational things for the future? And we thought a really easy way to depict that would be to illustrate services and products across 5 different generations. So we said, all right, let's, if you need something to help you frame where you're at today and where you need to be tomorrow, let's just wrap it around some generational generic ideas about services and products across time. And so we did that. And so as you then, chapter 3 pulls into, well, if you're going to execute those services and products at that generation, what does that mean about the people, process, technology involved? Yep. How do you change the skill set involved? Now we get into chapters 4 and 5 and talk about the skill set and the org chart and using external resources to notch it up a level. And then, we get into relationship management, business acumen, and the chapter that you wrote, Jason, on, all the GRC world and everything else that we really need to understand about second line of defense functions and what they should be doing, about the industry that we're in and those kinds of things that are, that's going a certain direction. Are we aware of it? Mm-hmm. Are we tuned into it? So the cool part and unexpected part in doing this first half of the book on setting up, on how a CAE goes about thinking about how they're set up, and then defining what steps they need to take and what pieces or what components of that make up their function have to change first to get there. The interesting part is then we got into delivering, internal audit. We started talking about risk assessment, and we had to rewrite that chapter twice. And it's the longest chapter in the book now because we said, you know what, we really need to illustrate how risk assessment was done across each of these generations, because it is done differently.
Yeah.
If you're just validating something, you almost don't need it. If you're coming in from objective-based risk assessment, top down, that's very, very different. You're asking some high-level questions like, okay, manager, this is your top objective. How have you responded to that objective in setting up oversight? It takes a fairly seasoned internal auditor to be confident, 1, to ask that question, mm-hmm. 2, to anticipate the response that would illustrate whether they're doing the right thing or not, or maybe they need to do something else. So that's a challenging question. And that's sort of an aspirational area that we want to get to. So as we looked at risk assessment, we realized, well, each of these generations also then influences the way the audit planning happens. If you're validating something, all you need is the standards. If you're getting into the top level, area, you need to understand what risk management is already happening. You need to understand how management has responded to those objectives in developing oversight and operations. Mm-hmm. And you need to have an idea in your mind of what is a reasonable timeline for setting up operations and how people are aligned with process and technology. This is where business acumen and an understanding of just generically how a business, sets itself up to be effective really is important to kind of a current internal auditor in this area. And then finally, in the next chapter, which is most important, when you get to the idea of, well, what do we mean when we say risk and control? Well, it's actually different. There is a different definition for risk and control in each of those generations. When you're trying to execute an objective-based internal audit, you're closer and you're pretty close to the ISO definition, which is risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I don't know that you can claim that if you're in one of those earlier generations. It's not that those earlier generations are wrong, and in some way we're always going to be doing some validation auditing. It might be that our compliance function is not working well, and so we have to be out there covering compliance risk. So I'm not saying that any of these generations is wrong or inadequate, but as we've striven isn't a word, but as we've attempted to improve over time and grab a little more value, it has changed our definition of risk and control. A control in a current level is, for example, at an objective-based internal audit, control means, has management responded to this objective by building metrics? Have they responded with reporting that reports on those metrics? Mm-hmm. Those are a couple examples of oversight control. How about alignment control? Has management made sure that the skill set in the people, the efficiency of the process, and the technology in place are all lined up and that they're working together, they're growing together? You haven't bought a technology that you can't use yet because nobody was trained on it, or vice versa, so that alignment. So those are kinds of controls that I bet most auditors out there today really wouldn't define as a control. But effectively, you're taking what management should be doing and you're saying that is a control for the organization. And that's really where when we get to that level and we're able to identify gaps early on, we're actually identifying, we don't need root cause analysis as much, because we're identifying gaps before they happen. This is a top-down approach. Mm-hmm. And there's a gap here, and many risks could occur if we don't implement a control. So long story short, pretty excited that the book itself at least provides enough. Maybe there's some things that are right and some things that are wrong, particularly in individual situations and circumstances, but at least it provides enough of a framing, I think, for a CAE or a leader in internal audit to really look at it, say, I'm here, and to anticipate what they may need to change to get there.
Well, because I think that's the important thing is as you're kind of moving up those generations, if you will, right? You're going to need different staff, people with some different skill sets.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. And so that's why, one of the concepts of kind of reversing the pyramid almost. You think of a pyramid, or a triangle, with a lot at the bottom and little at the top, that standard hierarchical type of organizational structure where you hire a lot of inexperienced people and you train them and they go up. I think for the most part, that model is kind of gone. If you're going to get up to that objectives kind of area, you're going to need those seasoned people who can have those discussions with the executives about objectives, about KPIs, about how they're actually monitoring some of these things, because that's what we should be looking for. It kind of reminds me back to my days in Arthur Andersen. We used to call them specific, pervasive, and monitoring controls. We had them broken out that way. And for a lot of times, internal audit has been down at those specific controls, those detailed things down at the bottom in the validation testing. And so, just one of my pet peeves, because I've done a lot in risk management, and it surprises me too. I get frustrated sometimes of how auditors who are supposed to understand risk talk about risk. Because I'll hear people say things like, well, there's a risk of a control not working. And I'm like, time out. That is totally not a risk, right? That's a control not operating. Now, if the control doesn't operate, there's some impact. That's the risk we need to talk about. But I think it's interesting as you describe that, of thinking about it from a generation type perspective. People that are down in the details doing the validation testing, that is what they're concerned with. They're concerned, their risk in doing the audit is concerned that the control isn't working.
Yeah,
but they're using different language than other people who are talking about risk, right? So same thing with risk. If you're talking about enterprise risk level strategic risks, people talk about risk differently than if you are a project manager worrying about risk in a project. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've seen too. People use the same words to mean different things depending on where they're at kind of in their role of risk.
And I really think that is why it took until 2009 for any standard setting organization to define the word risk. Mm-hmm. Risk was not defined in any set of standards until 2009. That was the ISO 31000 risk management standard. And it says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So very simple, and it actually did enable a lot of subsequent development. Because I think we can't think, and this is another interesting area that I've always kind of thought, what the perpetual goal of any organization should include the goal to change a transaction into a process, and a process into a program or an operation, and that into a system. And so there should be this evolution. Things should get more complex. If you looked under the hood of a 1968 Ford truck, and then you looked under the hood of a 2019 Ford truck, you would see a lot. There'd be
a lot of difference.
A lot of difference, right? And a lot of that difference is created because of what? Simply that the customer wants a different experience. They want a different experience in the cab. They want a different experience as they turn corners. They want a different experience in terms of life of the truck and the system. And so all of that change that happened under that hood, over that 50-year period of time was driven by that goal to create systems and complexity that can solve bigger problems. And so I think that is really what, let's think about enterprise risk management and where it was a few years ago. And this is another area that I think internal audit, unfortunately, was part of the party in my mind in terms of maybe solving ERM and promoting it in an ineffective way. If I went back to years ago, about a decade ago, I was asked to look at several health systems attempts at ERM in the United States. And my goal was to go, investigate these processes and come back with the best model. And we'd turn it into a consulting model where we could go and share the knowledge. The interesting part is that all those that I looked at, 1 year later, only one of them was still standing. Mm-hmm. And a key part of that is that I think the gap, we, not just internal audit, but all the second line of defense functions have to recognize that they manage a certain slice of risk for the organization. And until the leaders of the organization that are driving it can understand how to use that information, it may or may not work. And in the debris of some of these ERM functions that did not work, I was not surprised to hear some of the comments of, well, isn't risk management their job? Isn't, I feel like you're trying to get me to do your job. And so the issue that has really been there is I've seen a lot of good. So there's good on the side of a little bit what you talked about, Jason, in terms of there's good in recognizing that compliance and audit shouldn't be redundant. There's good in recognizing that, as we work together, we can do things better. But even some of the early attempts to look at elevating the top 10 risks for the whole organization so that that's what we can tell management that they need to manage, were a little bit disingenuous because it was taking a bunch of experts at their type of risk and telling them to pick 10, right? It's a little bit like going into the hospital and saying, I want a dermatologist, an orthopedist, an ER doctor, a surgeon, and I want them all to come and tell me what 2 things I need to care about, on my body. And so they would fight over whether the dermatologist wins or the orthopedist wins, and it isn't. So it's interesting. I think ERM really struggled in the beginning, but as we get closer and closer to really recognizing that control and risk start at the very top, and every action that management takes creates what we can call operational control. And yes, you have your risk functions over here that are responsible for those hazard things that could maybe management doesn't watch every day, and you need those functions. And you've got your executive team over here looking around the corner, really taking risk for the organization, which will impact the operations. But you've got all 3 types of risk, strategic, hazard, and operations. And management lives in operational risk every day.
Yep.
You almost have to interpret and put in context what you're trying to do around all this second line of defense function. And internal audit, ideally, the vision is that you're sitting up here and your umbrella covers all 3 of those areas, and you're capable of speaking to it and saying, hey, you've got some operational issues here. These hazard risks, many of these hazard risks can occur in this area of the operation because of its challenges. Or, that's really the role that internal audit should seek. You don't try to minimize or take away any of the second line of defense, need to be there. You really just try to leverage it and use it and be in the middle of it. And then I'll end with one comment on ERM, where some really interesting research out there, where there's a couple folks from the management consulting side of the world that have come into ERM and said, what really changes in an ERM environment for management? It's formality around decision making. Management.
That's what risk management is in essence.
It is. Effectively, risk management for leadership is essentially formalizing decision making. And you just simply ask your leaders to get at a certain scope and level to say, hey, above this or issues that'll impact wider than this, has to be formal, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to work bias out of our decisions. We're going to make sure our options are clear. We're going to test the data. And then at that point in time, all this risk information over here, all the risk information that the leaders have, becomes really relevant to a specific decision that they're about to make. Mm-hmm. So kind of interesting, I guess, development. Maybe I'm a latecomer to this concept, but it seems like that's where ERM is going. The idea that management has to change their decision process to better leverage all this risk input that's being collected throughout the organization.
Yeah, and I think as we're kind of trying to need to kind of wrap up for our discussion today too. I think that's where I see internal audit being able to add a lot of value in the organization. Is there are lots of different types of risk within the organization. And so you talked about that. There's strategic level, there's operational, which my favorite thing to kind of pick on that is operational risk is, right, the risk you create by what you do. But it's, in some of these hazards or other things, and different people have different buckets on it. But where internal audit can actually act as the bridge between some of these different roles, right? If you understand and you learn how these different groups actually talk about risk, how they talk about controls, you can help to actually translate that and bring people together. Because like I said, sometimes when I post stuff out on LinkedIn, some of the comments that I get back about risk, and it's like, dude, what are you even talking about? And then I look, and it's some PMP project person, and it's like, okay, with a different context, now I understand what you're trying to say, but you totally didn't understand what I'm saying because I'm talking about strategic risk. And so again, it's internal audit because you have, the contact points with so many different people in the organization, it really is a great opportunity to help make those connections, help people integrate together, and then, like we said, kind of be an assurance function on assurance or on the management monitoring. That's where we should go, right? And 20 years ago at Arthur Andersen, that's what we were talking about. It's like, specific pervasive monitoring. If the pervasive controls are working, okay, this was kind of the high level, which are a lot of those things, that we talk about in like, context kind of area and governance. If those are working and you have a good monitoring control, test the monitoring control. If the monitoring control works, you don't have to test the specific. And that's kind of where we should go. Again, at that objective level is, hey, management, what are you doing? And let's try to figure out if it's something that we can audit, if it's working, and they're monitoring the details, then we can elevate ourselves up and not have to be the ones going into the details.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's not always easy to do that, because you do have to have not just a vision for internal audit, but you have to understand the evolving future of enterprise risk management, that line of defense functions. And so it is challenging. And I have actually worked in this area to do just that. And interestingly, the first attempt to do just that has really been about what I would say is taxonomy. How do you create, and the question that we've been trying to solve is, all right, let's create a better risk assessment process, more objective based. We did that, but then we can't just leave it there. Let's say how each of these risks, in an objective based risk assessment, you have to define what objective is at risk. So is it a strategic objective? Probably not. It's usually in the operations somewhere. So what part of the operations is it going to impact and how? Maybe it's a mid-level risk, but then tag that part of the operations with a generic operational location tag. We're in finance, we're in accounts receivable, we're in governance. Maybe it's a governance function in the second line of defense or something. Wherever you're at, tag it with something that reflects a bucket of accountability by management. So that you can start throwing stuff in that bucket in terms of risk as audit, and then start inviting second line of defenses to throw stuff in that taxonomy bucket, so that the owner management of that taxonomy bucket doesn't need to just see your list of the top 10. They can poke their head into that bucket at any point in time and say, hey, information security is really worried about this. What are we doing? And so now you've got a give and a take, and management can see what's going on at the detailed level across the second line of defense functions, across internal audit, and can react. And then now enterprise risk management has become not only this top high level consideration, but it flows throughout the organization by promoting management to be proactive in responding to what all your risk functions care about, as well as to what your leaders are concerned about on the strategic end. So interesting progression. It'll be interesting to see how that continues.
Well, yeah, and so kind of, final thought then, is like you said, I really liked what you said at the beginning. Industries are changing, your organizations are changing. We have to change as well, right? Which is, again, that's the reason why Sawyer's got an update, and the title, this wasn't here before. Enhancing and protecting organizational value as a subtitle is there, and so it's incumbent upon us to go out, figure out, how can we up level internal audit in our organization? What can we do to help out? And I think, kind of in my estimation, try to work more with other people and get more involved in kind of that team kind of a feeling, kind of like what you're talking about. And then it becomes the give and take, and then people are going to see that we're adding a lot more value to the organization.
Absolutely. And I think, if you're a student or you're young in an industry today, what better job future could you see than to have that level of influence in your organization and that level of responsibility to sort of, make sure that the systems of accountability and the evolution of the enterprise is happening the way that it should. So, what a great career opportunity for all those young auditors that are out there is out there if we can just organize around it and continue. Now, I'm not going to say everything that's in Sawyer's this 7th edition is right. I think it's the best we had, and so we're already getting some great questions and thinking about, well, how do we use this in other areas of the IAEA and the way that they educate. So that's really what we're doing. We're here now. We feel like it's a great tool, and really have appreciated your participation, Jason, coming in with more GRC, second line of defense, experience, and contributing to that. That's really where we're at. We just need to know. We cannot, internal audit can't, as an industry anymore, ignore everything that's going on around it, particularly those things that'll change it. Yep. We need to be part of that. And I'm excited that this 7th edition is a big step forward, and excited for the next steps as well.
Well, Dan, thank you for taking time today. We got a lot more stuff we could talk about, so we'll have to get back on again later too.
Sure, happy to do it.
But really appreciate you, and for everybody that's listening, go out there. I mean, like you said, internal audit is a fabulous profession that actually provides you with a lot of opportunity to see what's going on in the organization and be kind of involved in a lot of the changes coming. So, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
You bet.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.